Erfurt, Germany, January 1349. The Jewish quarter has been burning for 6 hours. Somewhere in the rubble of what was once the most prosperous Jewish community in central Germany, a woman in her 30s falls. We don't know her name. We will never know her name. But in 2018, when a construction crew broke ground on a parking structure and hit medieval stone, her tooth was still there. Intact, sealed, waiting. It's a lower left molar, root intact, enamel sealed by 700 years of cold German soil. And inside that enamel, a full mitochondrial sequence. A genetic signature called K1A1B1A. The same sequence carried today by roughly 1/3 of the 10 million Ashkenazi Jews alive on Earth. One tooth. One morning in 1349. 3 million living people. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. Shai Carmi had spent years asking a question that almost no one could answer. Where, genetically, do Ashkenazi Jews actually come from? Not the family story, not the historical record, the biological answer. Working with David Reich's ancient DNA lab at Harvard Medical School, one of the most rigorous genetics operations on the planet, Carmi's team excavated 33 individuals from the medieval Jewish cemetery in Erfurt, the largest ancient DNA study of any Jewish population ever published. And what they found was not what anyone expected. The medieval Ashkenazi community was more genetically diverse than the modern one. Think about that. 600 years ago, the community in that cemetery showed 2 distinct genetic clusters, one with stronger Middle Eastern ancestry, one with more Eastern European ancestry. But today's 10 million Ashkenazi Jews are remarkably uniform, almost identical to each other, regardless of whether they grew up in New York or Tel Aviv. Something happened between 1349 and now that compressed all of that diversity into a single genetic profile. The compression happened before the fire, before the massacre, before everything. And buried in that compression is a father. His skull shows evidence of a violent blow. He's in the ground by late 1349. His daughter is beside him. Their mitochondrial sequences match. Sample EAJ-017. Sample EAJ-018. A family record that survived every century since, because it was sealed in enamel, not written on paper. If you've ever taken a commercial ancestry test and seen the words Ashkenazi Jewish in your results, if you want to understand what you're actually looking at when you see that, subscribe. Because what comes next goes deeper than any ancestry test can show you, and the answer has been hiding in plain sight for 5 years. The mitochondrial lineage in that tooth did not die in Erfurt. It survived. And it survived in a population that carries it at higher frequency than anywhere else on Earth, including one community that has never left the same 40-mile radius in 2,700 years. We'll get there, but first we need to understand what the teeth already knew. The lineage survived. That's the easy part. The hard part is the question the Erfurt data raises, not about the lineage, but about the event that created it. Because here's what everyone gets wrong. The genetic bottleneck that made modern Ashkenazi Jews so uniform, it didn't happen because of the 1349 massacre. The data says it happened before. 8 of the 33 individuals from that Erfurt cemetery carried the same disease-causing genetic variants we find in modern Ashkenazi Jews today. Mutations in BRCA1 and BRCA2, the genes most associated with elevated breast and ovarian cancer risk, precursors to Tay-Sachs. These aren't medieval diseases that arose from persecution. They are the biological fingerprint of a founding population so small that lethal mutations couldn't be diluted out through normal reproduction. The community in that cemetery, thriving, wealthy, well-documented in historical records, was already carrying this signature. The genetic crisis was already done. The massacre came later. So what created a founding population so small that their genetic damage is still visible in living people 700 years later? That number stopped me cold the first time I read it. The effective founding population of all Ashkenazi Jews, the actual ancestral group from which every one of the 10 million living today descends, is estimated to have been in the hundreds, not thousands, hundreds, like a single village. And yet, the data said something else that almost nobody talks about. The 33 individuals in that Erfurt cemetery weren't one population, they were 2. One cluster with more Middle Eastern ancestry, one with more Eastern European ancestry, different enough to be statistically distinct. And yet they were buried together, in the same community, in the same ground. They were, in that cemetery, in the process of becoming a single genetic profile. We are watching, in 33 teeth, the moment two populations merged into one. The population we now call Ashkenazi Jewish was still being assembled when the fire came. Now here's the piece that makes this a medical story, not just a historical one. The BRCA1 and BRCA2 variants found in those Erfurt teeth are the same variants that today give Ashkenazi Jewish women somewhere between a 60 and 87% lifetime risk of breast cancer, 10 times the rate in the general population. That's not history. That is a biological inheritance being expressed in living tissue right now, in people who had no say in receiving it. The founder event isn't a footnote, it's an active medical reality. But if the founder event predated the 14th century, if the bottleneck was already complete before Erfurt burned, then the entire timeline shifts. The question isn't what happened in 1349. The question is what happened before, and the answer to that question points away from Germany, away from Eastern Europe, toward a peninsula shaped like a boot, and a community in a specific city that has been there without interruption since before the Common Era: Rome. Specifically, the Trastevere neighborhood, and the Jewish community that has been documented there since the time of Julius Caesar. This is not a metaphor. The statistical modeling in the Erfurt study, using a method called QPADM that allows researchers to identify ancestral source populations, found that Southern Italian ancestry was the most plausible explanation for the European component in medieval Ashkenazi Jews. Not German, not Eastern European, Italian. The founding population that would eventually become Ashkenazi Jewry appears to have formed from a community on the Italian peninsula and then moved north through the Roman Empire's infrastructure into France and then Germany. The synagogue in Trastevere was built in 1904. The community it serves has been meeting in that neighborhood for over 2,000 years. The men and women buried in Erfurt in 1349 are, in a measurable genetic sense, their relatives, separated by 1,200 years and 900 miles. But here's where it gets strange. The Sephardi Jews, the community that developed in Iberia, built one of the great intellectual civilizations of the medieval world and was expelled from Spain in 1492. When researchers ran the same ancestral modeling on their genome, it converged on the same source, the same Italian peninsula, the same Roman-era founding population. Two communities, different languages, Yiddish for one, Ladino for the other, different liturgical traditions, different histories of persecution and exile, and underneath all of it, in the genome-wide data, they are branches of the same tree. The split happened in Italy, somewhere between the Roman period and the early medieval era. And then the two branches grew in separate directions for 1,000 years, developing such distinct identities that most people today treat them as fundamentally different populations. Genetically, the divergence is real. The source is shared. The Tempio Maggiore in Rome, the great synagogue completed in 1904, stands a few streets from where that original community would have lived. The Jews who built it almost certainly didn't know they were the genetic ancestors of both the Ashkenazi Jews of Eastern Europe and the Sephardi Jews of North Africa and the Americas. The science to prove it didn't exist yet. It does now. But this raises the obvious next question. If both Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities trace back to a Roman-era Italian source, where did that community come from? What's underneath the Italian layer? Because the Roman Jewish community didn't appear from nowhere, they came from somewhere. And tracing that backward one more generation takes us out of Italy entirely into a landscape of ancient cities and Bronze Age kingdoms and a genetic baseline that changes what we thought we knew about who these people actually descended from. To understand where the Italian source population came from, you need a starting point, a genetic baseline, something to measure against. That baseline comes from Tel Megiddo, the ancient city the Book of Revelation calls Armageddon. Lily Agranat Tamir and David Reich, working with Professor Israel Finkelstein at Tel Aviv University, published the most comprehensive ancient DNA study of Bronze Age Levantine populations ever assembled. 73 individuals, 9 archaeological sites across present-day Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon, people who lived between roughly 2400 BCE and 900 BCE, during the height of what the historical record calls Canaanite civilization. Every individual they tested shared the same material culture, and genetically they were remarkably consistent with each other, no matter which site they came from. They descended from two sources: earlier Neolithic farmers of the Levant, and a second component related to populations from the Zagros Mountains, the mountain range running along the modern Iraq-Iran border. That Zagros component entered the Levantine population in increasing amounts through the Middle and Late Bronze Age, a slow, centuries-long migration that reshaped the entire region. And yet, the data said the exact opposite of what the historical record implied. The Canaanites, the people the Hebrew scriptures describe as the problematic neighbors of ancient Israel, the ones the Israelites were warned against, the people at the center of some of the most contentious passages in the ancient record. Genetically, they are not a separate population from the ancient Israelites. They are the same population. When you take the genome-wide data from these Bronze Age individuals and compare it to the genetic signature of ancient Israelites, the overlap is so complete that distinguishing them by DNA alone is, at that Bronze Age level, essentially impossible. They weren't rivals with different origins. They were the same people, differentiating culturally while remaining biologically continuous. 3 individuals at Megiddo stood out as exceptions. They carried significantly higher Zagros-related ancestry than everyone around them. But their strontium isotope analysis, a technique that measures childhood diet and reveals where someone grew up, showed they ate local food their whole lives. They were second or third generation. Their grandparents had migrated. They themselves were Megiddo. This Zagros component, that slow wave of people from the mountains that feeds into the Tigris and Euphrates, is still in the genome of every Jewish community alive today. Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, Yemenite, they all carry it. It was there in the Bronze Age Levant before any of those community distinctions existed. It is, in a real sense, the oldest layer of shared ancestry that runs through all of them. Everything I just told you, hold on to it, because it's about to mean something completely different. Because there is a population in the modern world that carries this Bronze Age Levantine genetic profile at higher frequency than any Jewish community anywhere on Earth. A population that has been genetically tested. A population whose results have been in the peer-reviewed data since 2020. A population of exactly 750 people. And the reason you haven't heard about them is the part of this story that nobody has adequately explained. Actually, before we get there, I want to come back to something for a second. Last episode, we were tracking a civilization that left its DNA everywhere and its name nowhere. A population so old that the only record of their existence is inside the chromosomes of living people. This episode is working the same problem from the other direction. We have the population, we're tracing backward to find what they came from. Drop in the comments, which direction unsettles you more? Finding the ancestors or finding the descendants? Because the answer you give says something about how you think about identity. And I read them. Genuinely. Before we get to the 750, we need to clear something out of the way. Because for the past decade, one hypothesis has dominated the popular conversation about Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry in a way that has made it nearly impossible to discuss what the data actually shows. The Khazar hypothesis. And we're going to deal with it right now. Not because it deserves time, but because understanding exactly why it failed reveals something the data is actually saying. In 2012, a geneticist named Eran Elhek, then working at Johns Hopkins, published a paper claiming that Ashkenazi Jews were primarily descended from the Khazars, a Turkic-speaking polity that existed in the northern Caucasus between roughly the 7th and 10th centuries CE, and which historical sources suggest included some portion of converts to Judaism. The paper got enormous attention. It was covered by dozens of news outlets. It became one of the most read articles in its journal's history. By 2013, it had been methodologically demolished. A team of over 20 scientists, led by Doron Behar and including researchers from multiple institutions across Europe and North America, published a detailed refutation. The core problem was this: Elhek had used Armenians and Georgians as stand-ins for Khazar descendants. But Armenians and Georgians have no documented Khazar lineage. When you replace those proxies with populations that actually represent the geographic range of the Khazar Khaganate, the supposed Khazar signal in Ashkenazi Jewish DNA disappears completely. It wasn't there. It was an artifact of the wrong reference population. And yet, the data said something real. Here's the part that almost nobody noted at the time. The signal El-Hake misidentified as Khazar is the Bronze Age Zagros component, the same ancestral layer that Agranat Tamir and Reich found in the Bronze Age Canaanites at Megiddo 4,000 years earlier. The signal El-Hake was seeing was genuine. It really is in Ashkenazi Jewish DNA. It's in every Levantine-descended population. It just isn't Khazar. It's 4,000 years old, not 1,000. He found the right layer and read it completely backward. Now there's a human story underneath this that I don't want to skip. Arthur Koestler, the novelist, the intellectual, the Ashkenazi Jew, popularized the Khazar hypothesis in his 1976 book, The 13th Tribe. He did it, he said, to remove the racial basis for anti-Semitism. His argument was, if Ashkenazi Jews are converts rather than an ethnic group, then hating them on genetic grounds makes no sense. He was trying to use genetics as a shield. The genomic data that demolished his theory also, in doing so, demolished the racist framework he was trying to preempt. The biology did what the philosophy couldn't. The Khazar hypothesis is not an open debate. It is a closed case. Major ancient DNA studies confirm clear ancestral continuity between Bronze Age Levantine populations and Jewish communities today, across Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi groups, despite the different admixture they picked up during the diaspora. The Middle Eastern ancestry is real. The continuity is documented. The question that remains is not whether the connection exists. The question is, which living population preserves it most completely? And the answer is not in any direction anyone was looking. I want to stop here for a moment, because before we get to the genetic answer, the actual answer, the one that has been sitting in the data since 2020, while everyone argued about everything else, I need to go back to Erfurt, to a specific grave, and to a specific problem that the Waldman and Reich paper created without meaning to. The Thuringian State Office for Heritage Management has a photograph of the burial. Skeleton, female, approximately 30 to 40 years old at death. Grave orientation, east-west. No documented grave goods. Mitochondrial sequence, K1A1B1A. The same sequence carried today by roughly 1/3 of all Ashkenazi Jews alive. She has no name in any record that survived. Her father's name, whatever her father called her, burned with the community records in 1349. Her married name, if she had one, is gone. The paper that proved her biological significance to millions of living people refers to her as a data point in Table S4. The table is scientifically correct. The table is also, without intending to be, the saddest thing published in the journal Cell in 2022. This isn't just ancient history. This is in your DNA right now. If you have any Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, one grandparent, a fraction on a commercial test, there is a non-trivial, calculable probability that you carry a mitochondrial variant that traces through this woman, through this cemetery, through this specific winter. The science here is not metaphorical. The probability is real. And the scale of what flows from her is almost impossible to hold in your head. 1/3 of the 33 individuals tested from that community shared this maternal lineage. In a founding population of just a few hundred people concentrated in a single community, that frequency means the lineage was already ancient when the massacre came. She, or an ancestor of hers, was among the founding mothers of Ashkenazi Jewry. The bottleneck that gave her descendants this frequency was already complete before 1349. The fire didn't create it, it almost ended it. She didn't survive, her biology did. Every Ashkenazi Jew alive today descends from the same several hundred founders. The Rhine Valley massacres of 1096, the First Crusade, killed thousands in the communities where this founding population lived. It happened 250 years before Erfurt. If the founder event came after 1096, then the ancestors of today's 10 million Ashkenazi Jews survived the worst massacre their community had yet experienced, formed a new population from a few hundred people, and then watched that new population come within hours of annihilation again in 1349. The founders survived twice. We are the third generation of that survival. And if you want to understand which living population carries the uninterrupted version of what they were descended from, the Bronze Age Levantine genetic profile that existed before any diaspora, before any bottleneck, before any of the crises that shaped modern Jewish genetics, you need to meet the people who never left. 750 people. Half of them live in Holon, a suburb about 4 miles south of Tel Aviv. The other half live on the slope of Mount Gerizim near Nablus. They call themselves Shomronim. The English name is Samaritans. The 2020 cell study by Agranat, Tamir, Reich, and Finkelstein, the one that established the Bronze Age Levantine genetic baseline at Megiddo, when its findings were compared to modern population data, something unexpected appeared. The Samaritans clustered genetically closer to those Bronze Age Canaanite and Israelite samples than any other modern group. And in independent population analyses published in 2023, the Samaritans showed among the smallest genetic distances to Iron Age Israelite samples of any living population on Earth. Everything I just told you about Ashkenazi ancestry, the Italian source population, the Erfurt founder event, the Zagros layer running through Bronze Age Canaan, hold on to all of it, because it's about to mean something completely different. The civilization that matches ancient Israelite DNA most closely is not Ashkenazi Jews. It is not Sephardi Jews. It is not any community the world has spent 50 years arguing about. It is 750 people who simply never went anywhere. They are not Jewish by rabbinic definition. The split between Samaritans and what would become mainstream Judaism is documented in the historical record. A dispute over the correct site of worship, the authority of certain texts, the legitimacy of certain lineages. 2,500 years of separation. And yet, a study published in Human Biology by Peter Ofner, Noah Rosenberg, and Marcus Feldman from Stanford University and the University of Regensburg found that Samaritans are genetically most similar among all populations tested to Kohanim, the Jewish priestly lineage, the highest status hereditary class in Jewish religious tradition. The community they most resemble genetically is the community they have disputed with for 25 centuries. This has been in the peer-reviewed data since 2013 and in the ancient DNA data since 2020. No major documentary has covered it. No popular science channel has made it the center of a story. The answer to one of the most studied questions in archaeogenomics has been sitting in a published paper, unannounced, for years. And the reason the Samaritans carry this profile, the reason they are genetically continuous with the Bronze Age Levant in a way that no other living population matches, is that they did not leave. When the Assyrians came, when the Babylonians came, when the Greeks came and the Romans and the Byzantines and every subsequent power that reshaped the region, the Samaritans stayed on Mount Gerizim. They held their ground while everyone else was scattered. In late Roman times, their population exceeded 1 million. By 1917, there were 150 of them left. 150 people carrying the oldest continuous Bronze Age Levantine genetic profile in the world on the same mountain where their ancestors have performed the same Passover ritual for 2,700 years. The war that reduced them to 150 people was never resolved. It simply changed names. Survival is not free. The Samaritans at 750. The Ashkenazi founders at a few hundred. Both populations survived extinction-level events. Both populations are carrying right now, in living cells, the genomic record of how close they came to not surviving at all. The Samaritan Y chromosome picture is stark. The entire male lineage of 750 people traces back to approximately 4 paternal ancestors. 4. The genetic diversity in the Samaritan male line is comparable to a single extended family. And the biological consequences are exactly what you'd expect: elevated inbreeding coefficients, reduced immune diversity, and an increased risk of rare recessive conditions. The Ofner and Feldman team at Stanford documented this. The community knows it. They've been living with it for generations. There are 3 things this situation reveals. The third one is the one that changes everything. The Samaritan community today requires genetic counseling before every marriage. They maintain a community database tracking genealogical and genomic data. not as a scientific project, but as a survival tool. Without it, close relative marriages would accelerate the genetic risks that are already elevated. They are, in this sense, the most genomically self-aware human community alive, a people who know, in exact molecular terms, what staying cost them. The second thing it reveals, this is not unique to the Samaritans. The Ashkenazi BRCA variants found in those Erfurt teeth belong to the same category of consequence. A founder population too small to purge dangerous alleles through normal selection. Jewish communities worldwide now spend hundreds of millions of dollars annually on genetic screening for Ashkenazi-specific disease variants. That screening is not a response to persecution. It is a response to a medieval genetic bottleneck. Every dollar is the biological invoice from an event that happened before 1349, from a small community that survived everything and passed on, along with their resilience and their culture and their identity, the molecular record of how narrow the margin was. And the third thing, the one that stops you mid-thought, is this. In 2020, the Samaritan high priest gave an interview in which he described how the community actively seeks marriages with women from Jewish families. To broaden the gene pool, to reduce the risk. Two communities separated by a theological dispute that is 2,500 years old, now reaching across that divide for biological reasons. The rivals described in the ancient sources are now, in the most literal sense, each other's genetic partners in survival. Every human community alive today descended from a population that passed through a bottleneck at some point. A drought, a plague, a siege, a fire in a quarter in Erfurt. What the Samaritans and the Ashkenazi Jews carry in their genomes is not unique in kind. It is unique in documentation. We can see their crises in the data with unusual precision. Most people carry the same class of record and simply don't know it. Your genome is a document. It was written by everyone who survived long enough to have children. Every bottleneck your ancestors passed through left a mark in it. You didn't choose the document, you're living it. Before we go to the final piece, I want to ask you something directly. If you've done a commercial DNA test, 23andMe, Ancestry, MyHeritage, any of them, and you got an Ashkenazi, Sephardi, or Middle Eastern result you didn't expect, drop your percentage in the comments. Because what I'm about to say in the last segment may explain exactly where that number comes from, and why it connects to everything you just heard. I genuinely read them. Right now, on Mount Gerizim, the Samaritan community is preparing for Passover. The same ritual, the same mountain, the same prayers, in the same location, performed by the same lineage for 2,700 years. Not a revival, not a reconstruction, a continuity. There is a difference, and it matters. A remnant is what's left after destruction. The continuity is what persisted through it. If you carry Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, even one grandparent, even a small fraction on a commercial test, you carry a measurable probability of holding the K1A1B1A mitochondrial lineage. That lineage traces to the Erfurt cemetery, to a woman whose name burned in 1349, to a founding population of a few hundred people who moved north through a declining empire, to a Roman-era Jewish community on the Italian peninsula, to Bronze Age farmers and migrants in the Levant whose DNA was catalogued at Megiddo, at Tel Hazor, at Ashkelon. You are not metaphorically connected to that chain. You are literally built from its survivors. Every human being alive today carries this kind of record. Most of us have never been handed the translation. The Bronze Age Levantine genetic baseline, established in the 2020 Cell study, the Canaanite profile from Megiddo and 9 other sites, is present in measurable form in Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardi Jews, Mizrahi Jews, modern Palestinians, Lebanese, and Jordanians. It is present most completely in 750 Samaritans on a hill and in a suburb who never left. The science of that is now documented. What it means for everything built on top of it, the politics, the narratives, the competing claims, the science does not adjudicate that. It only shows what is there. That is both its limitation and its power. If this episode changed something, if one thing you believed at the beginning of it no longer sits quite the same way, subscribe and share it with someone who argued with you about history. The series goes further. Each episode goes deeper. There is more in the data than any 1 hour can hold. The tooth from Erfurt Grave 22 is in a climate-controlled storage facility in Thuringia right now. The woman it came from is not anywhere, but the sequence inside that tooth is in living people on every continent, in people who will have children, who will carry it forward, who will never know her name either. She did not survive. Her biology did. We are still deciding what to call that.